Imagine this scene unfolding before your eyes. You find yourself perched precariously on a treacherous, icy ridge, gazing down into the chasm below. Secured firmly to your boots are rudimentary wooden planks, crudely studded with rusty iron spikes. These improvised crampons, though primitive, bite tenaciously into the unforgiving frozen earth, granting you a remarkable and unwavering stability. Far beneath you, a formidable force, 9,000 of Europe's most elite knights, are helplessly losing their footing on the slick ice. Their magnificent war horses are succumbing to panic, their polished steel boots, designed for battle, now find no purchase whatsoever. They have arrived armed with expensive, expertly woven ropes, intending to hang you as a public spectacle. In stark contrast, your weaponry consists of nothing more than humble, readily available boulders, brought to utterly crush them. Within mere moments, the very pillars of the old world order are destined to be shattered into oblivion by the raw power of falling stone. This is the legendary Battle of Morgarten, a stunning account of how a determined group of farmers orchestrated and executed an absolutely perfect ambush. Before we delve deeper into these compelling yet often forgotten narratives of survival and suffering, if you possess a keen interest in uncovering the hidden truths embedded within history, please consider showing your support by hitting that like button and subscribing for more immersive content like this. And I encourage you to share in the comments below where in the world you're currently listening from. I personally find it truly extraordinary that we are able to explore these ancient sagas together, transcending geographical boundaries and connecting across vast stretches of time and space, all united by our shared fascination with the past. The precise date is November 15, 1315. The setting is a truly frozen nightmare, nestled along the edge of the formidable Lake Ageri. The very geography of this region conspires to form a natural guillotine. To your left, the frigid, dark waters of the Lake churn. To your right, the steep, densely timber-clogged slopes of the Morgarten mountain rise dramatically. Cutting a narrow path between these two imposing features is a treacherous mud track, barely wide enough to accommodate 2 horses abreast. Duke Leopold I of the venerable House of Habsburg, with audacious confidence, has marched his entire army directly into this perilous bottleneck, this veritable throat of the mountains. He harbors no genuine concern for intricate tactics, treating this expedition more as a casual hunting trip, a punitive measure designed simply to discipline some rebellious peasants dwelling within the forest cantons. His column, a magnificent and terrifying sight, stretches for miles, a glittering ribbon of flashing steel and opulent silk. They are loud, boisterous with their confidence, and utterly oblivious to the 1,500 men who lie hidden, holding their breath in the dense tree-line above. The Swiss Confederates, a hardened people, do not await a formal challenge. They do not unfurl banners or engage in ceremonial displays. With ruthless simplicity, they merely cut the ropes. What follows begins with a low, ominous rumble that reverberates deeply through the very soles of your feet. Massive tree trunks, deliberately stripped of their branches and stacked high in unstable pyramids, begin their thunderous descent down the steep slope. They rapidly gather terrifying momentum, snapping young saplings like brittle twigs, careening with destructive force toward the tightly packed column below. The impact is utterly catastrophic. The colossal logs smash directly into the heart of the Habsburg line, instantly shattering their meticulously maintained formation. Horses, driven to sheer terror by the deafening noise and the trembling earth, rear up violently. They slip disastrously on the slick, icy road, throwing their heavily armored riders. Men encased in steel armor crash onto the frozen ground, rendered helpless, unable to regain their footing, and are often crushed mercilessly under the hooves of their own panicking mounts. The column is now irrevocably severed. The vanguard, trapped at the front, finds itself unable to advance, its path completely blocked by a formidable, man-made wall of debris. Meanwhile, the rear guard is equally trapped, unable to retreat because the path behind them is choked with thousands of confused, panicking soldiers pushing inexorably forward. Utter chaos reigns supreme, and then the stones begin to fall. Boulders, some as massive as wine barrels, bounce menacingly down the cliff face, punching through sturdy shields and crumpling elaborate helmets as easily as if they were made of parchment. The desperate screams of men and horses alike utterly drown out the frantic orders of their commanders. The once invincible heavy cavalry is now nothing more than a terrified mob, hopelessly trapped in what has become a deadly bowling alley. And then, the Swiss launch their assault. They do not march. Instead, they sprint with astonishing speed down the treacherous icy slopes, their uniquely spiked boots granting them perfect, unwavering traction. While the bewildered knights below are reduced to a hapless spectacle, akin to Bambi on ice, the Swiss hit the utterly disorganized Austrians with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. This is not a battle, it is an execution. The Swiss are not seeking surrender. They wield halberds and morning stars, brutal weapons specifically designed to breach heavy armor and crush bone. A knight, struggling desperately to his knees, raises a gloved hand to yield, fully expecting the customary and civilized tradition of ransom. A Swiss farmer, with grim determination, answers this gesture by driving an axe directly through his visor. Blood sprays violently across the pristine snow. The knights caught on the very edge of the road are inexorably pushed backward by the crushing press of bodies. They topple helplessly into the frigid waters of Lake Egerie. The dark water churns violently as hundreds of men, weighed down by 60 pounds of plate and mail, sink inexorably into the black, silent depths. They are afforded no opportunity to even fight. They simply drown, watching the blurred surface of the world disappear above them. In less than an hour, the long-held myth of knightly superiority is utterly shattered. The Swiss have masterfully transformed the very terrain into a weapon, and they are using it with devastating precision to dismantle the Habsburg army, piece by bloody piece. However, to truly grasp why these farmers were enraged enough to massacre the nobility, and why Leopold was so foolish as to blunder into such a meticulously planned trap, we must first examine the powerful men who truly believe they own the world. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of this disaster, we must depart from the blood-stained snow of Morgarten and journey to the opulent marble halls of Vienna. We need to view the victims of this massacre not merely as lifeless corpses, but as they perceive themselves, the undisputed masters of the known universe. The House of Habsburg was far more than just another noble family. They were a geopolitical inevitability. By the early 14th century, this formidable dynasty was aggressively extending its influence, like insidious tentacles, across the heart of Central Europe. They exerted control over Austria, Styria, and vast swathes of what is recognized as modern-day Germany. They represented the quintessential, too big to fail, institution of the Middle Ages. Their immense power was ostensibly backed by divine right, vast stores of gold, and crucially, the heaviest cavalry units in all of Christendom. At the very epicenter of this specific catastrophe stands Duke Leopold I. He is a young man of 25 years, the younger brother of Frederick the Fair, who holds the prestigious title of King of Germany. Leopold embodies the archetypal high medieval aristocrat, ambitious to a fault, impeccably bred, and dangerously overconfident in his own abilities. Historical chronicles depict him as a man of decisive action, always eager to distinguish himself and emerge from the formidable shadow of his older brother. He possesses the finest armor that money can procure and commands a formidable retinue of knights who have dedicated their entire lives to rigorous training for warfare. However, Leopold harbors a fatal blind spot. He suffers from a pervasive condition that has plagued countless superpowers throughout history: the profound inability to imagine that a weaker enemy might actually possess the audacity and capability to fight back effectively. When Leopold surveys the map of the forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, he does not perceive a sovereign territory deserving of respect. Instead, he views it as a mere property dispute. These peasants, admittedly, possess imperial charters granting them a degree of freedom. Yes, but the Habsburgs conveniently interpret those legal documents as nothing more than administrative errors, inconvenient bureaucratic oversights that merely need to be corrected. To Leopold, the Swiss are not soldiers. They are simply rebellious tenants who are delinquent on their rent payments. This arrogant mindset fundamentally dictates his preparations, or rather, his alarming lack thereof. When the Habsburg army assembles in the town of Zug in November 1315, the prevailing mood is overtly festive. The knights proudly preen in their meticulously polished plate and mail armor. Squires rush about, diligently buffing shields emblazoned with intricate lion crests and imposing eagle emblems. They perceive the forthcoming march not as a perilous campaign into hostile territory, but rather as an elaborate pageant, a grand parade of their own might. Pay particularly close attention to the provisions they deem essential to bring along. The lengthy baggage train is laden with copious amounts of fine wine, luxurious clothes, and numerous extra horses. Crucially, the manifest also includes bundles of ropes not intended for scaling mountains, but rather for public hangings. Leopold's stated intention is to swiftly capture the ringleaders of the rebellion, execute them publicly to brutally restore order, and then comfortably return to a warm castle by Christmas. He brings no mountain guides, those invaluable experts of treacherous terrain. He establishes no complex or extensive scouting network. Why would he bother? One does not typically scout for mere cattle, one simply herds them. This pervasive arrogance, unfortunately, trickles down from the Duke himself to the very lowest squire in his service. The knights rigidly adhere to the code of chivalry, a sophisticated system of ethics that purportedly governs how noblemen should conduct themselves and, indeed, how they should kill each other. However, chivalry possesses a convenient loophole: it applies exclusively to one's peers. When engaging in combat with other knights, one is expected to display honor. But when confronting mere peasants, one is free to display the whip. They contemptuously view the Swiss mountaineers as subhuman, a disorganized rabble armed with nothing more than crude farming tools. Leopold's strategic plan is devastatingly simple in its conception. He intends to march his massive force south from Zug, penetrate the mountains via the ostensibly easiest route, and then utterly crush any resistance through sheer intimidation and overwhelming numbers. He blithely ignores the earnest warnings issued by the few local lords who actually possess an intimate knowledge of the treacherous terrain. One legendary anecdote, still told in Swiss folklore, involves the court fool of a local count. When queried about his opinion of the ambitious invasion plan, the fool sagely replied, "You have all deliberated extensively on how to get into the country, but none of you have deliberated on how to get out." Leopold, predictably, merely laughs off such prescient concerns. He places his absolute faith in the standard doctrine of medieval warfare: shock and awe. The mere sight of 9,000 armed men, a force that includes nearly 2,000 heavily mounted knights, is typically sufficient to send any peasant army fleeing in terror into the woods. He is banking entirely on fear doing the hard work for him. He is, in a sense, correct about the fear. The Swiss are indeed terrified. However, he gravely miscalculates their reaction to that overwhelming fear. Instead of scattering and running, the Swiss, with defiant resolve, decide to corner themselves. Leopold rides out of Zug on November 14th, his armor gleaming resplendently, his banners snapping proudly in the crisp wind. He is confidently leading the very flower of Austrian nobility into a narrow, frozen bottleneck, utterly convinced he is riding into a triumphant trophy ceremony. He remains blissfully unaware that he is, in fact, leading the funeral procession of the entire feudal age. But the Swiss did not simply awaken one morning and spontaneously decide to engage the emperor's brother in battle. This inevitable collision course was set in motion many years earlier, sparked by a violent raid that bore less resemblance to a formal battle and more to a brutal scene plucked directly from a Viking saga. History, as we know, is rarely a matter of simple black and white. While it is tempting to portray the Swiss purely as innocent freedom fighters nobly defending their homes, the unvarnished truth is far grittier. The incendiary spark that ignited the catastrophic bonfire of Morgarten was not a noble declaration of independence. It was a drunken, sacrilegious raid on a revered monastery. For generations, the people of Schwyz, one of the 3 foundational forest cantons, had been embroiled in a bitter, protracted feud with the powerful abbey of Einsiedeln. This enduring conflict was widely known as the Marchenstreit, or the March Quarrel. At its very core, this dispute revolved around the stark realities of survival economics. In the unforgiving landscape of the Alps, any stretch of flat land was considered as valuable as gold. Both the tenacious peasants and the cloistered monks laid claim to the same vital forests and pastures, essential for grazing their cattle and sourcing their precious timber. Tensions simmered ominously for decades. The abbot of Einsiedeln, under the protective patronage of the Habsburgs, frequently lodged complaints with the emperor, alleging that the rude peasants were illicitly stealing his timber. The peasants, in turn, passionately argued that the land had been unequivocally theirs since time immemorial, long before the monks arrived with their quill pens and legal land deeds. Then, on the bleak, wintry night of January 6, 1314, Epiphany night, the simmering pot of resentment finally boiled over. Led by their landman, Werner Stauffacher, a group of hot-headed men from Schwyz collectively decided they had endured enough of the abbot's persistent threats. They did not dispatch a letter of polite protest. Instead, they launched a full-scale, audacious invasion of the sacred grounds. They stormed the Einsiedeln Abbey. This was no polite occupation. The men of Schwyz forcibly broke down the doors, looted the monastery cellars, drinking the monks' sacramental wine until they were roaring drunk. They wantonly smashed precious relics, desecrated the revered altars, and ran wild and destructive through the cloisters. But their rampage did not halt at mere property damage. They rounded up the terrified monks, dragged them out into the biting snow, and took them hostage. This reckless act was tantamount to political suicide. In the deeply religious 14th century, attacking a monastery was universally considered equivalent to a direct assault on God himself. The retaliation was swift, brutal, and profoundly spiritual. The Bishop of Constance, at the fervent urging of the Habsburgs, placed the entire canton of Schwyz under interdict. This was nothing less than the nuclear weapon of the medieval church. It meant that no masses could be sung, no babies could be baptized, no marriages could be blessed, and most terrifying of all, the dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. To a profoundly religious medieval society, the people of Schwyz were now spiritually dead, condemned to wander hell for all eternity. Eventually, this devastating excommunication was extended to all three forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, because they defiantly refused to abandon one another. This, then, is the crucible that forged the indomitable Swiss Confederation. They were now outlaws, both in the physical and the spiritual realms. This critical context is absolutely vital to fully understanding the sheer savagery witnessed at Morgarten. When Leopold marched south a year later, he was not merely coming to collect overdue taxes. He was coming to execute heretics who had dared to lay hands on the sacred church. And the Swiss, for their part, understood with chilling clarity that surrender was an impossible option. One cannot negotiate when the enemy genuinely believes you are an agent of the devil himself. The audacious raid on Einsiedeln had utterly removed any safety net. The bridge back to peaceful coexistence had been irrevocably burned, its ashes scattered throughout the abbey's wine cellar. With their backs literally against the wall, the forest cantons fiercely renewed their ancient oath of alliance. They swore to stand together, united against the malice of the time. So, when scouts reported that the formidable Habsburg army was massing at Zug, the Swiss did not panic. Instead, they mobilized with grim determination. But they were few, and the enemy was legion. They desperately needed a miracle. Or, more accurately, they needed a colossal mistake from their adversary. And Leopold, blinded by his hubris, was about to deliver them one of truly monumental proportions. On the fateful morning of November 15th, the immense Habsburg war machine rolled out of Zug. It was a spectacle meticulously designed to inspire awe and terror. The rising sun glinted brilliantly off thousands of polished helmets, and the air was thick with the rhythmic clinking of mail armor and the heavy, earth-shaking tread of powerful war horses. This was proudly known as the Golden Column. Leading the way was the heavy cavalry, the undisputed tanks of the medieval battlefield. These were not mere soldiers, they were the celebrities of their era. Counts, barons, and knights from across the vast Habsburg lands rode knee to knee, their shields emblazoned with the intricate heraldry of ancient, powerful houses. They sat tall and proud in their saddles, exchanging jokes and light-hearted banter, eagerly discussing the lavish winter festivities that surely awaited them once this bothersome peasant annoyance had been swiftly dealt with. Behind the magnificent knights came the infantry, foot soldiers, skilled crossbowmen, and a multitude of servants, followed by a long, sluggish baggage train. In total, this imposing line stretched for nearly 3 miles. But as they advanced southward along the picturesque shores of Lake Ageri, the road began to narrow ominously. The wide, open plains abruptly gave way to a cramped, boggy track. To their right, the dark, cold waters of the lake lapped insistently against the shore. To their left, the ground rose sharply into the steep, densely wooded slopes of the Morgarten territory. The formation of the army was inexorably forced to squeeze. The line of knights, once an impenetrable wall of steel, thinned out into a long, dangerously fragile thread. In some sections, they were even compelled to ride single file. This is the absolute nightmare scenario for any military commander, the bottleneck. In this constrained formation, an army of 9,000 men is effectively reduced to an army of 1. If the frontman halts, the entire army grinds to a stop. If the frontman is attacked, the remaining 8,999 men behind him are powerless to do anything but watch. Yet Leopold, with his characteristic arrogance, pressed onward. He was utterly blinded by the ingrained pride of knightly chivalry. In his mind, the Swiss would predictably be waiting in a traditional shield wall on some open field, a perfect scenario where his knights could lower their formidable lances and smash through them like a hammer through brittle glass. The very idea that the enemy might not adhere to the established rules of engagement simply did not register within his privileged worldview. There exists a legend, persistent in Swiss folklore, concerning this pivotal moment. It is recounted that Henry of Hunenberg, a local noble with sympathies for the Swiss cause, attempted to warn the Austrians. He supposedly shot an arrow into the camp of the Schwitzers the night before, bearing a parchment inscribed with a cryptic yet potent message: "Watch out at Morgarten." Other historical accounts, however, suggest he directly attempted to warn Leopold himself, emphatically pointing out that the pass was an undeniable death trap. If such a warning was indeed given, it was tragically ignored. Leopold, in his hubris, most likely viewed caution as a cowardly trait, unworthy of a true nobleman. By mid-morning, the vanguard of the Austrian column had pushed deep into the treacherous defile, nestled between the steep slope and the unforgiving lake. The ground was frozen solid, slick and slippery as glass. The horses struggled desperately for purchase, their hooves scrambling for footing. The boisterous chatter among the knights began to subside, replaced by the heavy, strained breathing of the animals and the creaking of leather armor. The imposing shadow of the mountain fell darkly over the road, plunging the once golden column into a gloomy, foreboding twilight. They were now fully ensnared within the kill box. Above them, meticulously hidden behind dense screens of fir branches and piled snow, the men of Schwitz watched in silent anticipation. They could clearly discern the plumes adorning the helmets. They could even hear the faint voices of the men they were about to brutally slaughter. They waited with agonizing patience until the column had advanced so deeply into the pass that any thought of turning back was rendered physically impossible. Leopold rode near the very front, surrounded by his personal guard, a display of his perceived power. He was arguably the most influential man in the entire region. Yet, at this precise moment, he was undeniably the most vulnerable. He had, with his own hand, led his men into a corridor with no conceivable exits. And then, the mountain itself began to move. The attack does not commence with a triumphant war cry. It begins instead with the ominous, groaning sound of straining timber. High above the road, the Swiss defenders, with synchronized precision, sever the restraining ropes. Enormous tree trunks, ruthlessly stripped of their branches and stacked high into unstable, deadly pyramids, surrender to the inexorable force of gravity. They tumble violently down the frozen slopes, rapidly gathering speed, tearing through the dense underbrush and transforming into unstoppable battering rams of unimaginable force. The impact is nothing short of seismic. The colossal logs smash directly into the very center of the Austrian column with the devastating force of a train wreck. The result is immediate and catastrophic carnage. Horses are instantly swept off their feet, their legs shattered into gruesome fragments. Men are crushed inside their heavy armor before they even register that they are under attack. The tight, disciplined formation of the Habsburg knights vanishes in mere seconds, replaced by a screaming, writhing tangle of metal and raw flesh. Then come the stones. The Swiss, with foresight, had stockpiled tons of rock along the ridge. These now rained down upon the trapped soldiers like a relentless meteor shower. This is precisely where conventional medieval warfare tactics fail utterly and completely. Plate armor, a marvel of contemporary engineering, was meticulously designed to deflect sharp edges, swords, arrows, lance tips. It effectively transformed its wearer into a formidable walking tank. But plate armor possessed a fatal, inherent weakness: it simply could not absorb kinetic energy. When a 50-pound boulder drops from a height of 100 feet, it does not need to penetrate the steel to be lethal. It simply caves in the breastplate, brutally crushing the ribs and collapsing the lungs. It dents the helmet with concussive force, fracturing the skull beneath. The knights are not being stabbed, they are being bludgeoned mercilessly to death by the very landscape itself. The column buckles under the onslaught. At the front, the vanguard discovers the road to be entirely blocked by a pre-built, formidable wall of debris. They halt abruptly, but the thousands of men behind them, oblivious to the horrific carnage at the front, continue their relentless march forward. The column compresses dangerously. The pressure becomes unbearable, crushing. Knights are pressed so tightly together they cannot even draw their swords. Horses, driven mad by the deafening noise and the sickening smell of blood, begin to kick and bite indiscriminately, tragically trampling their own masters. The road quickly transforms into a gruesome slush of mud, snow, and blood. The trap is now irrevocably sealed. The Habsburg army is utterly paralyzed. The once proud golden column has been reduced to a stationary, helpless target. And then, the second, more intimate phase of the slaughter commences. The Swiss do not remain on the ridge. They draw their crude yet effective weapons and slide fearlessly down the slopes. They move with terrifying agility on their spiked crampons, descending into the kill zone like a pack of ravenous wolves dropping into a penned sheepfold. The knights below look up, dazed, concussed, and utterly terrified to behold a horde of bearded, determined men rushing toward them. These attackers do not carry elegant, chivalric swords. They carry tools that look disturbingly as if they belong in a slaughterhouse. And the most terrifying among them is a weapon that is about to irrevocably change the history of warfare forever. To truly comprehend why the Battle of Morgarten so profoundly shattered the medieval world, we must zoom in. Forget the sweeping wide shot of the entire army. Instead, focus on a single man. Let us imagine a knight caught near the very center of this horrific crush. We will call him Count Wilhelm. He is a seasoned veteran of countless tournaments, encased in a small fortune of gleaming Milanese steel. He is screaming frantically at his squire, desperately attempting to turn his terrified horse around in the bloody slush. In any other battle, Wilhelm would be an undisputed god of war. His impenetrable armor renders him virtually invulnerable to sword slashes, and his high saddle elevates him to the stature of a formidable giant. But today, a man steps out of the swirling fog directly in front of him. This man wears no armor. He is clad in a rough wool tunic and those peculiar spiked boards on his feet. In his hands he wields a 6-foot pole topped with a piece of iron that appears ugly, asymmetrical, and cruelly effective. This is the halberd. It is, quite literally, the weapon that killed the Middle Ages. Count Wilhelm draws his sword, his face still conveying a measure of confidence. He believes he has the superior reach, he certainly has the height advantage. But he utterly fails to comprehend the brutal physics of what he is now facing. The peasant swings the halberd. He does not aim for the knight himself, he aims deliberately for the horse's legs. The wicked axe blade shears through the animal's tendons with sickening efficiency. The horse collapses, screaming in agony, throwing Wilhelm violently into the mud. He is dazed, disoriented, and heavily weighed down by 60 pounds of cold, unforgiving metal. He struggles to scramble to his feet, slipping repeatedly on the treacherous ice. This is where the halberd's ingenious design truly reveals itself. It is, in essence, 3 distinct weapons combined into one devastating tool. As Wilhelm attempts to stand, the peasant does not swing the axe blade. Instead, he deftly uses the hook on the back of the weapon. He catches the rim of Wilhelm's shield, or perhaps the vulnerable gap behind his knee, and yanks with all his might. The leverage provided by the 6-foot pole is immense. A seemingly slight pull from the peasant translates into hundreds of pounds of force. Wilhelm is slammed brutally back into the icy filth, face down. Now for the kill. The peasant reverses his grip on the weapon. He brings the halberd down with a powerful, chopping motion, like a wood splitter. The heavy axe blade strikes the back of Wilhelm's helmet. It might not cut directly through the thick steel, but the concussive force alone is more than enough to scramble Wilhelm's brain, paralyzing him instantly. Finally, the spike. The peasant flips the weapon one last time. He quickly locates a vulnerable gap in the armor, perhaps under the armpit, at the groin, or through the narrow eye slit of the visor. With a powerful thrust of his entire body weight, he drives the razor-sharp steel point home. Count Wilhelm, a revered lord of the realm, is dead. He was killed by a simple dairy farmer wielding what was essentially a glorified tree pruner. This horrifying scene played out hundreds of times in the brutal span of a single hour. The halberd proved to be the perfect, brutal answer to the armored knight. It granted a poor, unarmored man the essential reach to safely engage a horseman, the critical leverage to pull him down from his saddle, and the piercing power to finish him off. It ingeniously turned the knight's greatest asset, his heavy, protective shell, into his very coffin. Once you are on the ground, entangled in the mud, armor ceases to be protection, it becomes an inescapable cage. The Austrian knights, trapped in the crushing press, watched in utter horror as their comrades were hooked and dragged mercilessly from their saddles like helpless fish. There was no room to launch a charge, no space to maneuver, only the rhythmic, sickening thud, thud, thud of halberds rising and falling, expertly opening up the Austrian nobility like tin cans. This was not merely a defeat, it was a technological revolution, brutally written in blood. The age of the invincible mounted knight definitively ended here, on a dirty, frozen road in Switzerland, at the business end of a 6-foot pole. As the initial shock of the ambush began to fade, the surviving Austrians desperately attempted to do what they had always done when a battle turned sour: they tried to surrender. In 1315, warfare between noblemen was, to a great extent, a business transaction. If you were a knight and found yourself hopelessly cornered, you would raise your visor, drop your sword, and loudly declare your name and lineage. You would then offer a ransom, a heavy purse of gold, a treasured family ring, or the solemn promise of future payment, in exchange for your life. The victorious knight would accept, take you prisoner, and later sell you back to your family. It was, in essence, a gentleman's agreement, a civilized custom. War was undoubtedly dangerous, yes, but it possessed a crucial safety net for the wealthy. The Battle of Morgarten, however, mercilessly cut that safety net to ribbons. When the Habsburg knights, trapped in the bloody slush, raised their hands to yield, they were met with confused, uncomprehending stares from the Swiss. These mountain men did not speak the international language of aristocracy. They held no regard for lineage, and crucially, they possessed no dungeons in which to hold prisoners and no extra food to feed them. So, when a knight offered his surrender, the Swiss did not perceive a valuable bag of gold. They saw a man who had explicitly come to burn their homes and enslave their people. The chronicles of the time described scenes of absolute, unmitigated horror. Knights screamed out desperate promises of immense wealth, holding up jeweled daggers as a desperate offer of payment. The Swiss answered with the cold, unyielding blade of the halberd. They hacked down men who were already on their knees. They brutally smashed the skulls of those pleading for mercy. There was no meticulous sorting of the dead from the living. No chivalrous pauses to allow a worthy opponent to rise. There was only the wet, visceral thud of iron on flesh, repeated mercilessly until nothing moved. This savage behavior sent a profound shockwave through Europe, one that was even more powerful and far-reaching than the military defeat itself. To the sophisticated French or English courts, this was not war. It was an abominable crime against the very natural order. It was as if the sheep had not only managed to kill the wolves, but had done so without exhibiting the proper respect for the established food chain. The ferocious determination of the Swiss was driven by a specific, cold logic. They understood with chilling clarity that if they allowed these men to live, they would simply return the following year with an even larger, more vengeful army. They had to make the cost of invasions so astronomically high, the memory so utterly terrifying, that the Habsburgs would be forever too afraid to return. They were sending an unmistakable message, brutally written in the blood of the Empire's finest. We do not play your game. This radical, no quarter policy fundamentally altered the psychology of the battlefield. The Austrian soldiers realized very quickly that their expensive armor and their high birth would not, in fact, save them. Panic, which had been simmering just below the surface, now boiled over into absolute, uncontrollable hysteria. If surrender meant certain death, and fighting meant certain death, then only one desperate option remained: escape. But the road back was hopelessly blocked by the crushing press of their own army. To their right was the impossible, unscalable mountain, which left only one terrifying direction: the lake. The treacherous edge of Lake Egerie thus became the final, tragic act of this horrifying drama. Driven by the relentless, unyielding pressure of the Swiss advance, hundreds of Austrian knights were physically pushed off the narrow road and into the frigid water. In the summer, a swim might have offered a desperate means of escape, but this was November. The water was absolutely freezing, instantly shocking the breath out of anyone who plunged in. And then there was the immense weight. A full suit of battlefield armor, combined with the padded gambeson worn underneath and the heavy sword at the hip, weighs anywhere from 60 to 80 pounds. On land, a fit man could run and fight in it. In the water, however, it became an instant anchor. The knights who fell in did not splash and swim. They sank immediately, with chilling swiftness. The chronicles of the time paint a nightmarish picture. The surface of the lake churned violently as horses, maddened by their wounds, thrashed desperately in the shallows, tragically kicking their own riders. Men struggled frantically to undo their buckles with numb, frozen fingers, gasping for precious air, tragically dragging each other down in their mounting panic. But the straps of medieval armor were notoriously complex, often requiring a squire's assistance to remove. There was simply no time. Bubbles rose ominously to the surface, followed by an unsettling silence. The elite of Austria drowned just a few short yards from the shore, their blurred shapes watching the carnage of the slaughter through the murky water above them. Meanwhile, at the very head of the column, the architect of this unmitigated disaster was witnessing the complete collapse of his world. Duke Leopold the Firm, as he was known, did not die at Morgarten. But the man who rode out of Zug that morning, the arrogant, golden prince, was gone forever. In his place stood a broken fugitive. Realizing that the battle was utterly lost, Leopold's personal guard managed to forcibly clear a path back through the chaos, likely shoving their own men aside to ensure their lord's retreat route. Historical accounts describe Leopold fleeing the scene looking utterly like death itself, his face drained entirely of color, weeping openly with a mixture of rage and terror. He was forced to ride hard over the difficult terrain, abandoning his army to the merciless butchers on the ridge. By early afternoon, the screaming had finally ceased. The silence that settled over the pass was heavier, more profound, than any fog. The road itself was a ruin of smashed wagons, countless dead horses, and the broken, twisted bodies of nearly 2,000 Habsburg soldiers. The pristine snow was trampled into a gruesome crimson slush. The water of the lake, usually crystal clear, was stained a sickening pink for distinct stretches along the shore. The casualty count for the Austrians was, quite frankly, a statistical impossibility. They had lost the very core of their nobility, counts, barons, and knights by the hundreds. The Swiss, on the other hand? The chronicles vary slightly, but most agree they lost approximately 12 men. Not 1,200. 12. The few survivors who limped back to Zug carried with them more than just their grievous wounds. They brought a contagion of fear, a chilling tale. They recounted stories of terrifying, forest devils, who seemed immune to death, who struck from nowhere with brutal efficiency, and who respected neither rank nor God himself. The myth of Habsburg invincibility had been decisively left at the bottom of Lake Egerie. But for the Swiss, their work was far from over. They meticulously stripped the dead, taking armor, weapons, and jewelry that would provide crucial funding for their independence for decades to come. And as the electrifying news of their astonishing victory spread, it didn't just reach the ears of kings. It reached the ears of anyone across Europe looking to hire the deadliest, most effective soldiers available. News of the massacre at Morgarten spread across Europe with the terrifying speed of a plague. In the opulent courts of Paris, London, and Rome, kings and cardinals alike read the reports in stunned disbelief. The very narrative of the Middle Ages had just been irrevocably rewritten. For centuries, the military equation had been deceptively simple. Heavy cavalry overwhelmingly triumphs over infantry. Aristocracy inherently surpasses peasantry. Morgarten, however, proved that equation profoundly wrong. But something truly strange and unexpected occurred in the immediate aftermath. The monarchs of Europe didn't merely fear these formidable mountain men, they wanted to buy their services. This pivotal moment marks the undeniable birth of the most lucrative export in all of Swiss history, Swiss mercenaries. Before the rise of sophisticated banks, before world-renowned chocolate, and long before luxury watches, Switzerland exported violence itself. The hardened men of the forest cantons quickly realized that the very same skills they had employed to brutally butcher the Habsburgs, iron discipline, masterful terrain knowledge, and absolute, unwavering ruthlessness, were incredibly high-value commodities. Their native land was poor, its soil rocky, and its winters harsh. But their wealthy neighbors were perpetually engaged in conflict. The Battle of Morgarten served as the ultimate, chilling marketing campaign. It unequivocally proved that a disciplined block of infantry could effectively halt a cavalry charge dead in its tracks. Suddenly, every duke and king embroiled in a border dispute desperately sought to incorporate a unit of Swiss soldiers into his vanguard. The Swiss evolved rapidly and intelligently. While Morgarten was primarily won with the halberd, they soon adopted the pike, an 18-foot-long spear that allowed them to create impenetrable forests of steel. They developed the formidable pike square, a military formation that was essentially a moving fortress, capable of rolling over enemies like an unstoppable steamroller. But their formidable brand wasn't merely built on innovative tactics, it was forged in psychology. Remember the infamous no quarter policy at Morgarten? That became their chilling trademark. When you hired Swiss mercenaries, you weren't just hiring soldiers, you were hiring terror itself. Enemy armies would often break and flee simply upon catching sight of the distinctive Swiss cross or hearing the deep, booming call of their war horns. They knew, with absolute certainty, that if the Swiss won, there would be no ransom, no mercy, and absolutely no survivors. The Swiss meticulously cultivated an unparalleled reputation for absolute contractual loyalty. They did not fight for a grand cause, they fought solely for their paymaster. If you paid them, they would willingly march into the very mouth of hell for you. If you failed to pay them, well, no money, no Swiss, became a famous proverb for a very clear reason. This mercenary trade utterly transformed the Swiss cantons. Gold from France, Italy, and the papacy flooded into their remote valleys. The simple shepherds who had so decisively crushed Leopold the Firm became the true power brokers of Europe. They dominated European battlefields for the next 200 years, profoundly influencing the rise and fall of countless kingdoms. Even the Pope, ensconced in the Vatican, observed the carnage of the 14th and 15th centuries and concluded that the only men he could truly trust with his sacred life were these formidable mountain warriors. The pontifical Swiss Guard that meticulously protects the Pope today, with their colorful uniforms and ceremonial halberds, is the direct, living lineage of the very men who stood defiant in the snow at Morgarten. The victory at Lake Egerie didn't merely save a small confederation from utter destruction, it launched a military-industrial complex that profoundly defined an entire era. The peasants had definitively proven that they didn't need knights to protect them. They could, in fact, kill the knights, take their gold, and then take their jobs. But all dominance, inevitably, must eventually end. The golden age of the Swiss mercenary would ultimately decline with the invention of gunpowder and artillery, which possessed the devastating capability to blast apart their tight, disciplined formations from a safe distance. Yet, the enduring spirit born at Morgarten, the powerful idea of armed neutrality and fierce independence remained a fundamental cornerstone. So, what profound lessons does this medieval slaughter impart about the world we inhabit today? Today, if you visit the serene shores of Lake Azure, a profound silence has returned. A simple, unassuming stone monument stands near the roadside, overlooking the tranquil water. It is a modest marker for an event that, in its time, truly turned the world upside down. The Battle of Morgarten was far more than just a clever ambush. It was the definitive moment the Swiss Confederation proved its undeniable right to exist. It powerfully demonstrated that a small, fiercely determined population, skillfully leveraging their treacherous terrain and fighting with absolute ferocity, could defiantly stand against and defeat an empire. This is a timeless lesson that history ceaselessly repeats. We observe the distinct echoes of Morgarten in the brutal winter forests of Finland in 1939, in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam in the 1960s, and in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan. It is the enduring doctrine of asymmetric warfare, when the little guy resolutely refuses to play by the rules dictated by the big guy. The outcome is rarely a foregone conclusion. For the Swiss, Morgarten became the fundamental foundation of their national identity. It birthed the enduring concept of armed neutrality. They learned that lasting peace isn't simply granted by the goodwill of neighbors. It is secured by making oneself too painful and costly to swallow. The Swiss effectively became the porcupine of Europe, peaceful if left unmolested, but utterly deadly if provoked. The knights of the House of Habsburg rode into that pass believing that their noble lineage and their expensive armor inherently entitled them to victory. They died discovering that war cares nothing for titles or social standing. It only respects leverage, brutal physics, and the unwavering will to kill. The 1,500 peasants who stood on that ridge didn't just defend a border. They shattered the entrenched feudal assumption that some men are born to rule and others are born to serve. They definitively proved that free men, fighting fiercely for their own soil, are unequivocally the most dangerous soldiers on earth. So, the next time you cast your gaze upon the peaceful, postcard-perfect mountains of Switzerland, remember the harsh reality that lies beneath the pristine snow. That enduring peace was bought at a terrible, brutal price. It was paid for in the freezing mud of 1315, with the blood of princes and the decisive swing of a halberd. If you thoroughly enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal origins of the Swiss Confederation, you might find my other videos, which dissect the tactical failures of history's greatest empires, equally compelling. Click on the video on your screen right now to discover how another seemingly invincible army was ultimately destroyed by its own hubris. And please, don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell notification. History is overflowing with forgotten warnings, and we are committed to uncovering every single one of them. I'll see you in the next one.